Good evening. My name is Tiana Adams, co-founder of You Speak Up, and I wanted to welcome the audience to You Speak Up panel COVID 101 Ask the Expert series. As of today, January 14th, 23.2 million people have been infected with COVID-19, with 386,000 dying from this disease. It is safe to say we have all been impacted directly or indirectly by COVID. Whether you telecommute, your children participate in online learning, or your favorite small business has been shut down due to the economic effects of this disease. This panel today is an opportunity for you to ask those questions that you feel the media has not done a great job of answering. Please use the chat feature and ask the questions for our experts. We want this to be an interactive learning experience for you. Remember, the only silly question is the one that is not asked. I now introduce you to Dion Calhoun, co-founder of You Speak Up.
Tiana, thank you for that warm welcome. Hello, everyone. I am Dion Johnson Calhoun, co-founder of the Youth Speak Up movement. Although we are living a new normal, during the COVID-19 pandemic, our youth have led powerful virtual discussions from policing in the schools to the historic presidential election and positioning themselves for leadership or elected office. This will make our third virtual town hall meeting, but this particular one hits different. We have been planning this COVID 101 series since the summer, and it started with a discussion from the three founders on Marco Polo. It hits different for me because I am the face of a COVID survivor. I was among the fortunate to beat it. COVID has many faces, and no one is exempt from getting it. This discussion will be so powerful because we have the experts right here to set the record straight and to educate us. So, Youth Speak Up. Who are we? The mission of Youth Speak Up is to provide a platform to empower youth to speak on issues that impact their quality of life. The youth have a lot to say, but I find that they are oftentimes left out of the conversation. We need to hear from our youth. We want their voices to be heard, particularly as we shift in movement and hold conversations on health, race, and equity. The youth have innovative ideas. They use social media to raise awareness on issues, and they want to lead. We have to pass the mantle and equip them with education and resources. When we started this movement with our inaugural youth-led discussion and peaceful march to stand in solidarity of the Black Lives Matter movement, we started with the youth-led discussion at Freedom Plaza, and we ended with the march at Black Lives Matter Plaza. Families from all over the nation, including Columbus, Ohio, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Atlanta, and Pittsburgh, came to DC to show their support. Now, finally, I would like to introduce our co-founder and moderator of the evening, Dr. Bendu Bayan, who put blood, sweat, and tears into making this vision of the COVID 101 panel a reality. Now, for our young people watching, there is so much work and passion that goes behind the scenes. Dr. Bayan is a health scientist from Indianapolis, Indiana, and she coins herself as a STEM entrepreneur. She is sharing her STEM career journey as an innovator in technology by driving the culture forward. She's inspiring young girls and young boys through her innovative platform and helping our youth solve problems through life science. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Bendu Bayan.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Dion, and thank you, Tiana. And welcome, everyone, to COVID 101. This interactive webinar is designed to give you the opportunity to ask questions about COVID-19. This is just the first webinar in our COVID series, so be on the lookout for future panels as well. As Tiana mentioned here, there are no dumb questions, and our panel of experts are really excited to interact with you via the live chat function. So first, let's meet the panelists. Dr. Ama Semenya is an account manager at Stem Cell Technologies. Ama obtained her PhD in immunology and molecular pathogenesis from Emory University. After completing her PhD, she worked at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and at the National Institutes of Health as a postdoctoral fellow, where her research focused on parasitic diseases. We also wanted to note that Ama is participating in this event as a scientific expert, but all her views are her own, and she is not here as a representative of Stem Cell Technologies. Welcome, Dr. Semenya. Next up, we have Dr. Nipun Chopra. Dr. Nipun Chopra is an assistant professor of biology at his alma mater, DePauw University. In keeping with his neuroscience background, his research interests are in the field of neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. Nipun is extremely passionate about scientific communication and committed to a lifelong fight against pseudoscience, which is why he joins us today. Outside of his scientific endeavors, Nipun spends much of his time watching and playing football, the real one, the one that actually uses their foot to kick the ball, and spending time with his dog, Octavia. Welcome, Dr. Chopra. Lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Tiana Garrett-Cherry. Dr. Garrett-Cherry is a consultant and founder of Indices Consulting, LLC, a public health consulting agency based out of the DC metropolitan area. She is an epidemiologist with over 10 years of experience in public health practice federally with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and multiple state health departments. Dr. Garrett-Cherry received her Bachelor of Science from Virginia State University and her PhD and MPH from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Welcome, Dr. Garrett-Cherry. As you all can see, we are in good hands for this webinar. So let's jump right into some questions. As a reminder, you can submit your questions for the experts via our live chat. So like I said, let's jump in. But before we go in to the chat, I just want to kind of probe the audience. If you're out there and you have actually had COVID-19, we want to hear from you. So let us know, have you or anyone close to you had COVID-19? If so, what was your experience? Let us know in the chat. So I want to jump into my first question for Dr. Semenya. So let's just get down to basics. What is coronavirus? And why do we hear coronavirus sometimes? We hear COVID other times, and we hear SARS-CoV-2. Can you distinguish those things for us?
Yeah, so as you said, sometimes the terms coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, and COVID-19, they're often used interchangeably when people are talking about the current pandemic. But the terms do have different meanings. So coronaviruses are just a type of virus. So there's many different types of coronavirus, and SARS-CoV-2 is the name of a specific type of coronavirus. And it's the newly identified coronavirus that's causing the respiratory illness or the respiratory disease, COVID-19. So SARS-CoV-2 is the virus, specifically a type of coronavirus, and COVID-19 is the respiratory disease that is caused by that virus.
Thank you so much for clarifying. So I just wanted to make sure that we kind of, knocked that out in the beginning. And my next question is going to be actually for Dr. Chopra. So we've heard about what COVID-19 is, but now I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit of the background behind where it came from. It kind of seems like we were all going about our lives and then we heard of this new disease. So could you tell us a little bit about where it came from and how is it that a new illness seemingly came out of nowhere and how are people getting it?
Sure. And first of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me. I think I'm really excited about this. This is super important for us to do. So thank you to all the organizers. So where did coronaviruses come from? So we've known about coronaviruses for about half a century now. Actually a century now. The first animal coronaviruses were discovered in the 1920s, and the first human coronaviruses were discovered in the 1960s. They caused this cold-like symptoms in, I believe it was in England that they were first discovered. And then there was a bunch of stuff that was discovered after that. Then 2003 hit, and there was this huge outbreak of the SARS pandemic, epidemic in China. And that was the first human coronavirus that caused these flu-like symptoms. And then we had another version of that in 2014 called MERS, which was the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which was also caused by a coronavirus. And now, of course, we have, as Amma pointed out, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19. So coming back with that lens, coming to your question, which is where did it come from? The honest answer is we don't know for sure. What we believe happened is that there was this thing that in biology we call zoonosis. That's a fancy way of saying a virus or a bacteria or some sort of pathogen jumping from an animal into human beings. As you might imagine, a lot of the times animals have their own diseases and humans have their own diseases. And when one jumps from animals to humans, we call it zoonosis. When something turns from human to animal, we call that, what do we call that? Something else osis. But we believe that COVID-19 is an example of a zoonotic event where most likely it was developing in bats. We don't know that with certainty. That's our best hypothesis at this time. But due to a zoonotic event, this virus, which was likely replicating and doing its thing in bats, was able to jump into humans and survive in humans and replicate in humans. And that's our best hypothesis from where this thing came from.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for clarifying that. I think it's really interesting thinking about how diseases can, move from animals into humans, and therefore it seems like it's coming out of nowhere. But as you explained, actually there is a source. So I want to kind of now move on to the actual illness. So I want to ask you, Dr. Garrett Cherry, we want to know what we should be looking out for. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the symptoms of COVID-19 and how it is distinguished from the flu?
I'd like to echo the previous sentiments and say thank you for inviting me to this panel. This is such an important topic and you're targeting such a special group. And so thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this. You're asking very valid and interesting questions. There is a lot of information about COVID-19 and what the symptoms are, but there's a lot of misinformation as well. And so I kind of want to tackle the questions that you asked together to find out how COVID-19 is different from the flu. So both COVID-19 and the flu are respiratory diseases, and they're both caused by viruses, as was explained a little earlier. Many of the symptoms of COVID-19 and the flu are the same, which is kind of what makes it difficult to tell the illnesses apart. The symptoms of COVID-19 and the flu that are the same include fever, cough, having a runny or stuffy nose, having body aches, and feeling very tired or being fatigued. However, the symptoms of COVID can be more severe and cause more body damage than the flu. It can cause serious conditions that can affect both your blood vessels in your body and different body organs. Public health officials have found that COVID can cause people to have extreme shortness of breath, which is one of the hallmarks of COVID. They've also found that COVID can cause people to have to go to the hospital more frequently of severe virus than a person who has the flu. Another thing we need to talk about when it comes to the difference between COVID-19 and the flu is that scientists have found that a person with the flu might be able to spread it to about 2 people at a time, whereas COVID-19 is actually easier to spread than the flu. So one person with COVID-19 might be able to spread it to up to 7 people. Another distinguishing mark between COVID-19 and the flu is that with COVID-19, it's possible that a person can have the illness and not have any symptoms. That's called being asymptomatic. However, they'd still actually be able to spread the virus to another person. Now, this is rare with the flu. Most times, a person who has the flu is going to either have symptoms or develop them over time. Another thing that is different between COVID-19 and the flu is that a person who has the flu tends to develop symptoms fairly quickly within 1 to 4 days of getting infected. But a person with COVID-19, it can take up to 14 days for them to show symptoms if they are going to show symptoms. That's why if a person is potentially exposed to someone who has COVID-19, it's highly suggested that they self-isolate, stay at home, and avoid contact with other people for between 10 to 14 days. Now, Bindu, one thing that I do want to make sure that the audience knows is that it's possible that a person can have the flu and COVID-19 at the same time. So it's important that anyone who's experiencing any of the symptoms that I mentioned get tested. And the best way right now to prevent from getting the flu is to get a flu vaccine. For COVID-19, we're still working on some of the vaccines that I'm sure people have heard about, and I want to touch on a little later. But the best way to prevent yourself from getting COVID-19 is to wear your mask, socially distance at least 6 feet from other people, and to stay home if you have some symptoms until you get tested.
Thank you so much for that. I think that clarifies so many questions that I think a lot of us have, especially with the symptoms being so similar. And it's something that we're hearing a lot. So I'm glad that you brought up, social distancing and wearing a mask, which have to be also effective against getting the flu as well, right? So
yes.
If we just don't want to get sick, we're going to wash our hands, we're going to keep our distance from folks, and we're going to avoid symptomatic people and all of those things. So I think that's a great segue actually into my next question. You kind of brought it up. I want to, kind of ask a little bit about, the vaccine and, or excuse me, a little bit about testing. Excuse me, you mentioned getting testing. And so I want to ask Dr. Chopra, if you can tell us a little bit about COVID testing, because, we've heard about people, being asymptomatic, as, Dr. Garrett Cherry mentioned, and then, still having a positive test. So can you tell us a little bit about how the test works and what does it actually mean when you get a positive COVID test? What does that mean?
Sure. And again, super important question. And like everything we've talked about, the answer is really, really long. So we're going to try to abbreviate and kind of hit the highlights here. So setting aside some caveats, there are in general, 2 major types of testing. The first one tests for current virus in your body. And the second type tests for flags of previous infection. So one tells you currently have COVID, and another one tells you had COVID. And we're not going to talk about like some of the obvious caveats, but in general, those are the 2 things. So when you get a positive COVID test from the first kind, which is something we call PCR testing, which stands for polymerase chain reaction, which is not important, but it's telling you whether or not you have the virus currently. When the test tells you that you're positive for COVID, or PCR test tells you it's positive for COVID, it means that you have a measurable amount of virus, of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that Amma pointed out and Tiana was talking about, in your body. That's basically what that tells you. If you get a positive antibody test, which is the other kind of test, it almost definitely tells you that you had an infection. It doesn't tell you that with certainty, but almost definitely tells you that you had that you were infected at some point. And depending on the kind of antibody test you get, it could also tell you whether or not you currently have the infection. But that's just, again, a tangent that we don't need to get into.
Thank you. That really, really helps. And I think a lot of folks are just curious about, like I said, getting someone testing negative and then still being able to be sick and just understanding like, how accurate these tests are, and are there ones that are better or worse than others? And I see that someone is asking about the type of test. So the nasal swab being one of the methods, or there being a blood test. So can you speak a little bit about how
Sure.
effective these different methods are and why?
Absolutely. And again, the answer is it depends. It depends on which company you're going to, which test you're getting. But again, in general terms, the most accurate test is that PCR test that I talked about, the one that tests for measurable virus. And Tiana asked in the chat whether the nasal swab is the only way to test for COVID. It's not. You can actually get a cheek swab, and it's right at this moment not exactly as highly robust as the nasopharyngeal, which is where they go right into your nose and feels like they're tickling your brain. That's the most accurate test. But from realistically, the cheek test at this point is showing up to be highly effective as well. The blood test is the one that tests for hints of your previous infection. That's the other kind of test. So if you want to test for whether you have if you currently have the virus, you want to get a nasal or a cheek swab, but most importantly, you want to get the PCR test, which is basically telling you, hey, it looks like you have the virus. And coming back a little bit to what you said, I think, Tiana, you pointed this out earlier. It's possible that your test is negative, but you actually have COVID-19. And that's been a huge battle in this pandemic, is the asymptomatic portion of that. Some of that has to do with the fact that what I had said earlier is that you have a measurable amount of virus in your body. What happens is sometimes you do have the virus, you just don't have a measurable amount of it. You just don't have enough for the machine that detects it to say, okay, there's virus here.
Gotcha.
So that's an important caveat to also know.
Gotcha. Okay, well, thank you, because I know that's something that comes up a lot. And just thinking about some of, the things that we are hearing about and the things that are coming out in the news, I want to ask Dr. Semenya, we've heard some news about potentially a new, more infectious strain of COVID. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Should we be worried? Are the tests that are available right now going to help us detect that?
Yeah, so as you said, there are some new strains. I think one of the first ones that came out was out of the UK. And I kind of also just want to talk about how new strains come about. So it's actually something that's common for viruses to get mutations. It's not uncommon to see this. And one of the ways that viruses can mutate is when the virus actually replicates. So when it's replicating, it's actually making a copy of the virus. And mistakes or mutations can happen and can be incorporated when you have that replication or when the virus is making a copy of itself. So sometimes those mutations will have no effect on the virus whatsoever. And sometimes it will have an effect, like we see with that UK strain, where it's now more transmissible than the previous strain.
Wow, okay. Should we be worried, or should we, is it something that, I mean, you've said it's pretty normal for that to happen? Is that, something we need to be, following very closely, or is it something that we can kind of put on the back burner for a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that we have to look out for. I know right now they're doing testing to make sure that the tests that we have available to detect COVID are also will detect the new strains that are coming out. So it's definitely something that we have to watch for. But I think one of the ways we can really address and make sure that we aren't getting a lot of these new strains developing is really to stop transmission of the virus. That's one way to really stop making sure that the virus isn't able to replicate. And it's based upon some of the things that we talked before to be able to stop transmission. So things like making sure that we're practicing social distancing, making sure that we're wearing our masks, making sure that we are washing our hands frequently, and when the vaccine is available, making sure that we get the vaccine. So that's really one way to address the mutation of the virus, is making sure that we stop the transmission of the virus.
Great point. And I think, it's something that almost everyone has, mentioned, but, wearing your mask, social distancing is still so important. At Youth Speak Up, we're encouraging folks to wear their masks with the mask now, mask later. campaign, we are really, really focused on, like Dr. Semenya mentioned, getting or slowing the transmission, of this disease. And so I want to actually switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the topics that are surrounding COVID. And we know that there's a history of medical mistrust in marginalized communities. I saw a question come in about encouraging folks to get tested. And so I want to ask you, Dr. Garrett Cherry, with your, kind of public health expertise, we know that there's this history of medical mistrust in marginalized communities, particularly in the Black American community, which has been drastically impacted by systemic racism in healthcare. Can you speak a little bit about how medical mistrust is playing out in this pandemic and how it is affecting views of individuals and the views that they have on a vaccine, on the illness itself, and et cetera?
Yeah, that is such a great question. So unfortunately, there is a long history of the medical system in the United States discriminating against people of color, particularly Black and Latino communities. And there's also a history of medical experimentation on people of color that dates back hundreds of years. And this experimentation was done so that doctors could learn more about diseases and how to treat them. But unfortunately, the way that they were carried out was not the best way as far as the people who were being affected. So one of the most common examples that people talk about when it is concerning this topic is the Tuskegee study, which happened between the 1930s and the 1970s in Alabama. And this primarily happened to poor rural Black men. This study was meant to look at the natural progression of a sexually transmitted disease called syphilis when it's not treated. So they basically wanted to see when one of these men contracted syphilis, how would the disease play out on their body if they didn't receive any treatment at all? So the problem with that is there actually was a treatment available during this time called penicillin, but the people who were in this study were not giving the penicillin to treat it because the doctors wanted to see naturally what the syphilis did to their bodies. And so because of that and other things that have happened, such as some of the studies that were done on Black female slaves to learn more about the reproductive system, there's a lot of concern in the Black community and in communities of color about COVID-19, misinformation concerning COVID-19, and the vaccine in particular. We also know that there are things going on right now where COVID-19 is actually affecting communities of color more than they seem to be affecting their white counterpart communities. And so it's important to think about how getting this vaccine will be able to reduce the number of people in these high-risk communities from getting the illness. Unfortunately, we also know that sometimes communities of colors can have worse medical outcomes than white communities. And as you mentioned, racism and discrimination plays a large part in that. So it's understandable why communities of color would be skeptical about COVID-19 and the vaccine, but it is important to think about the benefits of taking the vaccine. One thing that we want to make sure that people understand is that COVID-19 is real. It's a disease that someone can get, as was mentioned at the beginning of this segment. And we want to make sure that people understand that this vaccine has been created so that essentially people will be able to lessen the amount of disease that is circulating in the population and to allow us to get back to the way our lives were before the pandemic.
Thank you so much for touching on that. I think that, like you mentioned, it is, not a coincidence that individuals that belong to these communities, have developed this medical mistrust. It's not something that came out of, thin air. It's there. It's not unfounded. And so I think it's really important for people to acknowledge that there's a reason that you might feel the way that you feel. But I think that's why it makes discussions like we're having today really important, so that we can kind of get the information out there. I thought I saw a question we had a question come in from the audience. Do antibiotics work against the coronavirus?
I'd be happy to answer that. So antibiotics don't work against the coronavirus because antibiotics work against bacterial infections. And coronavirus, as we mentioned, is a viral infection. So again, antibiotics are not going to work against the coronavirus.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, it's the analogy I use with my students for that question is, think of antibiotics as someone with a hammer that can only break orange walls. Antibiotics will break the homes of bacteria, but viruses have totally different homes. Their outside walls are totally different. So no matter how much those antibiotics come in and try to hammer those walls, the virus walls, they can't break those apart.
That's a really good, I love being able to break stuff down very simply. So thank you. Okay, so we have another question coming in. It says, is the virus real airborne as well? Also, must everything be washed and disinfected when entering your home? The groceries, the shoes, the clothing, the mail. I actually love this question because that was me, like, second week in March. I was like spraying just air, right? with everything, Lysol, rubbing alcohol, whatever. So I love this question. How airborne is COVID?
So I'll tackle this question. So this is what we know about COVID, and this is what we know about a lot of similar type of respiratory diseases. The disease is spread actually on droplets that can be spread when a person is in contact with another person, and it could be spread through talking to the person, laughing with the person, singing. It actually comes from the droplets that come from your mouth and your nasal cavity. That's a little different from it being airborne. Airborne means that it's actually able to be stable within the air and transmit in that way. It's still questionable whether COVID-19 is airborne. There are some studies that say it may be, and others that have refuted that. So I think scientists are still learning whether COVID-19 is actually an airborne illness. Also, to tackle your question about it living on surfaces. Now, it's possible that it can live on the surface for an amount of time. I think that's still being studied. So I think that the key is to still do your disinfection, making sure that you're washing your hands to get the virus, off of your hands and removing it from surfaces. But we're still really learning things about the stability of the virus being airborne and how long it would live on a surface. Over time, like over the past few months, we have seen that it may not live on surfaces as long as we initially thought, but to err on the side of caution, continue to disinfect, continue to wash your hands for at least 20 seconds.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add as far as the possible airborne nature of COVID?
Yeah, I'd like to add that the one area that I think evidence suggests that we should worry about it possibly being airborne, and I'm so glad Tiana pointed that out, that what we're really talking about, it's important to define what we mean by airborne, because sure, it is if you have projectile spit coming out of your mouth, it's airborne in that sense. But what we as scientists mean airborne means it's just floating along in the air unencumbered, right? And that's unlikely. However, what we've seen is that if you're in a restaurant, for example, and someone has COVID, there's a study in South Korea that showed that there was a few people in the restaurant, and the restaurant was closed off. It was an indoor restaurant, and the air was not really humid. It was dry air. There's some evidence that the virus can actually travel when the air is dry for longer than 6 feet, right? So the recommendation has been 6 feet. Is the reason the 6 feet recommendation is there is because that's how far your droplets are traveling when you talk or laugh or spit, right? Well, not spit, but while you do your normal everyday activities. But there's evidence that that may not be enough, because in indoor scenarios where there isn't a lot of airflow, where the air is dry. So that's the only area we're concerned about. But I think the big thing right now is that if you are indoors, you should wear a mask, and you want to be as far away from someone as possible for that reason. But other than that, I think the big concern still remains water droplets.
Gotcha. And I think, we have a question coming in. Sandra is asking, how long do the droplets linger in the air? I know that, folks are concerned about, maybe getting in an elevator after someone, who potentially was ill, and, that was an enclosed space, and are the droplets still hanging out? And what amount of time needs to pass before, that space is clear? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not a droplet physicist by any means. So if the other experts wanted to chime in, I mean, honestly, as long as it would take for a droplet to be ejected from someone's mouth or nasal cavity to the ground, or if someone sneezes, as long as it would naturally linger in the air. If the person had COVID, it wouldn't mean that it would linger in the air any longer than if a person didn't have COVID and sneezed. So that's actually a difficult question to answer, because it would just depend on the situation and the person. That's kind of a difficult question. It's just, as long as the droplets are in the air. I can't say that if someone was in an elevator and a person sneezed and someone else came in the elevator, they wouldn't have to worry because they wouldn't come in contact with any of the droplets. It could happen. Or it could not happen. It really depends. That's a very difficult question to answer. The most important thing to consider in that scenario is just to maintain social distancing and to wear your mask to make sure that you're overall covered.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. I think one of the, side things that we're, expressing by doing this panel is actually showing folks that really brilliant people don't have all the answers, right? So like sometimes the answer is we don't know, and that is okay. And I think that, it's the reason why we want you to continue to ask the questions that, you might think they are dumb questions, but, go ahead and ask them. Go ahead and put those questions in the chat, and we will continue to answer them. So again, we wanted to make sure that we were covering everything that individuals were very concerned about. And as you can kind of see with some of the discussion, we're kind of leaning very much close to the vaccine, right? So we happened to start planning this before a vaccine was approved. And so in the time that we were planning this webinar, there has been a vaccine that is available. And so another question I want to ask to the audience, are you going to get vaccinated when it is available to you, or have you already been vaccinated? Why or why not? Let us know in the chat so we can talk about it. So for the second half of the webinar, we want to focus on the vaccine. So I'm going to pose this question kind of to all the experts, and you can kind of chime in. Can you all speak to how the vaccine works? We are hearing about individuals taking the vaccine, and that there are like different types of vaccine. And so how does it work, first of all? And then how does it prevent you from getting COVID?
So those are two big questions. So let me try to break it down just a little bit. So you're right. There are 2 COVID-19 vaccines that have been approved for use within the United States. And you may have heard that some people are starting to get the vaccine, particularly those who are considered essential frontline workers, such as those who work in hospitals and elderly people. So the vaccine themselves were created using a small piece of genetic material called messenger RNA, or mRNA for short. And this mRNA is from the virus that causes COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 that was mentioned earlier. The vaccines that have been developed do not have any live virus in it at all. So none of the live virus that causes COVID-19 is used within the vaccine. At this point, I actually have to ask, how deep do you want me to go into the vaccine question? Because that can go deep.
So I think, even just talking about what it is, right? So I think, a question that often comes up is, am I getting like a little bit of the disease, and that's what they're giving me, and I'm supposed to build up an immunity that way, and that's how I'm gonna fight it off. So I think, you're really on the right track. I appreciate you just explaining, what is in it. I mean, just so folks know kind of what, if they do decide to get vaccinated, what it entails.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm on the right track. So to go back to what you just mentioned, no, you aren't getting a live piece of the vaccine that causes COVID-19. You are getting a piece of genetic material that is in a shot. The shot is placed in typically your upper arm. And what happens is this small piece of material, your body uses it to create a protein that's a harmless protein. It won't hurt you in any way, but it's a protein that's similar to a type of protein that SARS-CoV-2 makes. Your body then recognizes the protein and starts to develop an immune response to it. So earlier you heard about these flags that your body recognizes. These flags are called antibodies. These are what are created when your body starts to generate an immune response. So if a person who has COVID-19 or is exposed rather to COVID-19, and they've already taken this vaccine, their body can fight the virus better because their body has already built some immunity to it. That's how the vaccine works. It basically primes your body or prepares your body with antibodies so that if it comes in contact with the virus that causes COVID-19, then your body is already raring to go and is able to defend itself easier and faster.
Gotcha. Okay, so that really clarifies some things. I know that when we think of a lot of folks think of a vaccine, they think they're actually going to give me, the disease. So the chat is booming. So I want to go ahead and go to some questions. We have a question saying, if a person has underlying conditions such as high blood pressure, diabetes, or other allergies, should they be concerned about getting this vaccine?
I can jump in real quick. So there was a report in late December, early January that a couple of individuals, one in Britain, one here stateside, had an allergic response to the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. That's one of the ones that has that mRNA, the messenger RNA that Tiana talked about. Because of that, at this time, the FDA recommends that if you've had a history of having an allergic reaction to other vaccines, say you took the flu vaccine and you had an allergic response, at this time, you not get the vaccine. But that's the only reservation that I know. For most people, once you get the shot, they ask you to stick around for 15 minutes for that reason, because if you were to have an allergic response, it would be almost instantaneously within 5 minutes, I don't know, give or take. So that's the reason why after you get the shot, you're supposed to stay for a little bit of time. So there's no real risk in that sense. In terms of high blood pressure or diabetes, I don't think there's any contraindication. I don't think there's any reason why someone that has those conditions would be worried to get the COVID vaccine. In fact, I would say if you have those conditions, it's very, very, very important that you get the vaccine, because if you have high blood pressure and diabetes, you are at an elevated risk for having bad symptoms of the disease.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Could I also
Go
I
ahead.
also jump in there and say something? I would also say just talk to your primary care physician, just to kind of make sure that they are aware of your specific issues, your specific allergies, and things like that. It's definitely important to ask them about your particular situation as well.
Yes, I want to echo that as well. You know, we wanted to do this panel, you know, to inform and, you know, just to get some knowledge out there. But, you know, your individual situations are best addressed by your healthcare provider and someone who kind of knows your individual situation better. So, okay, we have other questions coming in, and it's about the vaccine as well. So, with the development of the vaccine in place, how close are we to a medication that is similar to Tamiflu for this virus? Great question.
So we do already have a medication that is under emergency use authorization, and that's remdesivir. I don't know if you guys have heard that. That's been in the news, and that's similar to Tamiflu in that it stops the replication of the virus. So there is a medication that already is out there similar to Tamiflu.
Awesome, thank you. And I actually wanted to ask, just related to that, with the vaccine, you know, say I take the vaccine, do I still now have to like wear my mask? Do I still have to, like, if I'm vaccinated, am I like free and clear? How does that work? And yeah, it kind of goes along with the question that just came in. Is it safe if I go to my friend's house and stay 6 feet away with my mask off? If I've been vaccinated, can I get a little closer? Like, what are the ramifications of, you know, kind of combining this advice of vaccine, mask, 6 feet away?
I can jump in if no one else wants to take it. Tiana, did you want to jump in? Okay, so in terms of, sorry, the first question was about the whether you need to wear a mask after the vaccine. Is that what you asked, Wendy?
Yeah.
Yeah, so right now, one of the biggest unanswered questions about the vaccine is, even if you are prevented from getting the disease, are you actually preventing yourself from passing on the virus? That is a completely unknown because of the way the trials were designed. They were only designed to test for people that develop symptoms. In other words, we don't know whether people are asymptomatic, and we don't know whether it prevents you from passing on the virus. It's likely that you're prevented from passing on the virus, but we just don't have any evidence of that. So yes, even after you get vaccinated, even when you develop immunity, for now, you have to continue to wear a mask because it's possible that you may pass on the virus to someone who is not vaccinated.
And then if I may chime in here, one thing that we haven't mentioned yet is that with both of the vaccines that have been authorized for use, there's 2 shots that you have to take. And they're about 3 to 4 weeks apart. So you could get the first shot and your body start building immunity, but you still could actually, if exposed to COVID-19, get sick. So during that time frame, it's important that you still would wear your mask, you would still social distance, you would still wash your hands for at least 20 seconds to make sure that you're practicing the things that you would typically have to do to prevent contracting the illness.
Really good to know. And I think, folks are, getting more and more familiar with the vaccine as their friends and family, or, they're knowing people who have had it. We have a comment that's come in saying, I read that a congressperson got COVID after receiving both doses of the vaccine. I thought the vaccine stopped someone from getting COVID. So could you talk a little bit about how an individual could receive the vaccine and still test positive for COVID?
I can take that. I think there's two things there. The first is that the vaccines aren't 100% effective, right? They have really high efficacy, somewhere in the 90%, but again, it's not 100%. And the second thing is in the trials, what they were looking for, as has been said before, is that they were looking for the development of symptoms and not necessarily whether or not the vaccine or the virus could still be transmitted. So there's still questions as to whether transmission can still occur. We do think that transmission will be stopped, but the clinical trials really just looked at whether or not someone was developing symptoms.
That is really good to know. I think it's good to, manage our expectations for what a vaccine is, and, even possibly what a treatment is, because we like to think in terms of cures and things that will make us, never encounter something again. So thank you so much for clarifying that. And so we have another question, just asking if you could touch a little bit more on developing immunity as it relates to the virus. So individuals that maybe have been exposed to COVID-19 and maybe they were asymptomatic or they were symptomatic and they've had COVID, what does immunity look like for those individuals? Or are there people who are naturally, more immune to getting it, or not? What are your thoughts?
The naturally immune part of that question, I am personally not familiar with that. Maybe the other panelists would be able to address that. But in essence, immunity means that if you were to come in contact or be exposed to the virus, that your body has built protections, internal protections, those antibodies that I was describing earlier, that ensures that your body would be able to fight the illness. It also can activate other types of cells in your body, some cells that kind of would, for lack of a better term, capture the virus and disintegrate it, make sure it goes away. And so it really just, in essence, boosts your immune system to ensure that if you were to come in contact with the virus, that it wouldn't be able to harm you. Or if it did, it wouldn't be at the same level of severity as it would have without.
And sorry to use my weird analogies, but I always like to use the analogies I use with my students. So the analogy I like to use is like developing immunity is, you take a picture of this bad guy and you stick it on a wall and say, that's someone we need to watch out for. And then for the rest, not the rest of your life, I shouldn't say that. In this case, for a certain amount of time, we don't know how long, as soon as that person walks through the village, the security personnel are like, okay, we know this guy is going to cause trouble, so we need to get to him immediately. And that's basically the concept of immunity. It's not perfect. There are issues with that analogy also, but that's generally how it works. Is our body takes a snapshot of what the pathogen is and remembers it for a certain amount of time. In the case of measles, your whole life. In the case of the flu, a few months to a year. We don't know how long that'll be for the case of coronavirus. We believe it's going to be, it may end up being an annual virus vaccine. It may be a biannual vaccine. We don't know. But at this point, it seems very unlikely that it'll be something like measles or chickenpox or something, which is almost lifelong.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. I think, we've had folks commenting whether or not they will get vaccinated or not. Folks saying, we'll get vaccinated. I'll also encourage my parents who are in the vulnerable population, 65 and older, to get tested as well. And so I think, folks' views on the vaccine are, I think, like I said, changing as more people who've had it, who've had the vaccine. We've got another comment saying, I got Moderna yesterday along with my 85-year-old dad, and I just have a sore arm. Both of us are fine. Glad I got the shot. So, we're seeing some folks getting vaccinated, which is encouraging. So, I want to just take a little breather for a second and hear from someone who has actually experienced COVID. So we are going to take a little break and hear a little clip, and then we'll be back.
Hi guys, I'm Dion, the founder and visionary of Youth Speak Up. This virtual discussion is so important to me as I am a COVID-19 survivor. For our youth, it's so important to have this discussion today to raise awareness, to address the lack of education and misinformation around COVID, and to allow you to ask questions with the experts that are right here today. So we want you to blow up the chat box, engage with our experts, and keep in mind that there is no dumb question. When I was first diagnosed with COVID, I have to be fully transparent. I was terrified. I was terrified because of the fear of the unknown. I got COVID early on in April when there was little data circulated. I have very young children, and my main concern was their health and wellness. If it was not for my health and wellness lifestyle, I may not have beat COVID, but I am pleased to report to you that I was able to beat the virus. As a health expert, I am educating the masses on COVID, the little that I know, and what I have experienced. But every case is different. And I'm not a licensed physician, but we do have the experts here today to empower you with education and to set the record straight. So youth, listen up and speak up with your questions and your comments. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for sharing your story, Dion. I think that it's important for folks to realize that, the illness does have a face. And, there are many of us who have folks in our family or friends who have actually been impacted by the disease. And so thank you again for sharing that. So I want to jump right back into questions from the audience. Angela is asking, are there more and different vaccines being developed? And could you tell us a little bit about maybe how they're different from the vaccines that are available?
So yeah, I'll jump in and talk about one that's actually close to getting authorization. They're just finishing up some of their phase 3 clinical data, and that's from Johnson & Johnson. And how this is different from the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine that are out there. It's actually only one shot, which is going to be good in terms of being able to get that widely distributed. And it's also a vaccine that you can store refrigerated for months at a time. So it's different than the Moderna and the Pfizer that need to be stored in either a freezer or an ultra freezer as well. So there are definitely other companies who are in different phases of clinical trials for the COVID-19 vaccines.
Awesome. That is encouraging. So actually related to that process, is anyone worried about the fast drug development process that occurred in order to bring the vaccine to market? I know we're hearing a lot about, well, I don't want to get this vaccine, it was rushed. Do you guys have any thoughts about they're being concerned around how quickly the vaccines are coming out?
I'll step in on this one. So the National Institutes of Health has worked very hard with other organizations, such as the Food and Drug Administration, to ensure that companies that are developing these vaccines are doing what they're supposed to do to make sure that they are effective and that they are actually providing immunity for people. So what they've done is something that's called a clinical trial. Typically, there's multiple phases of clinical trials, and they have recruited a number of people to take the vaccine to make sure that it is going to work in a larger number of people. So what they do is they get a smaller group of people, sometimes called a sample of people, give them the vaccine, and then make sure that these people are actually gaining the benefits of the vaccine before they distribute it to a larger group of people, which is what's happening now, the distribution of the virus. It did happen a tad bit faster than what typically happens with vaccines. So it's understandable that there is concern that it happened fast, but there has definitely been things put into place to make sure that the vaccines are effective, to make sure that the people that they tested the vaccines on during these clinical trials were representative of the people who are going to receive the vaccine by demographic groups such as race, by age, and by sex, because they want to make sure that it's going to be beneficial for all of those who take the vaccine. So even though the process does seem a bit rushed in comparison to how other vaccines are made, there are definitely best practices put into place to ensure that they would be effective.
Thank you for that explanation. I think that, folks are, a little bit scared about, the process and thinking about it being sped up. And so I really appreciate that. We have a comment that came in that says, but someone said that in the case of this vaccination, the manufacturers were ready to push these to market, and this helps speed things along as well. And so, Dr. Chopra and Dr. Semenya, do you have any thoughts about how companies, were able to kind of, move some of these, the vaccines to market very quickly, as well as, the actual process of developing it?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why they were able to push out the distribution and push it to market much faster is because they were able to do the manufacturing of the vaccines alongside doing the actual clinical trials. So typically they would wait until the clinical trials are approved and then do the manufacturing. But because of the urgency of the situation, they were able to do that manufacturing alongside other clinical trials. And once the approval happened, they were able to immediately then distribute the vials that they had manufactured.
Gotcha. So it's really interesting to see how, when multiple arms, of the translational research process work together, how quickly things, can get done. And it kind of speaks to how well, when things are organized, how well things can get completed. So I want to move on to some more questions about taking the vaccine itself. We have a question here saying, what are some of the long-term effects of taking the vaccine? Do we know, or any of you familiar?
I don't think anyone knows. I think the first person to get a vaccine would have received their vaccine in July of 2020 for phase 1. That would have been phase 1 of the probably the Pfizer trial, or maybe the Moderna trial would be the earliest anyone got one of these vaccines. So basically, in other words, the longest time frame we have is 7 months right now. we just don't know whether there are long-term side effects. There's very little evidence in the history of vaccinations that I should say that differently, in the recent history of vaccinations, that there will, if a side effect doesn't show up in the first couple of months, it'll suddenly show up way in the future. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. And what we've done with vaccines since the 1940s, 50s, where they first came into regular circulation, is we've iteratively improved them. And some of the stuff that caused side effects has been over time removed from vaccines, and they've only gotten better. So the honest answer is we don't know, Damien, but it's unlikely that, because we haven't seen something in 7 months, it's unlikely that we'll start to see it. Having said that, as we vaccinate more people, there are going to be vaccination into subpopulations that we didn't get to test before. So there could be a question, well, does this vaccine have an impact on someone who is Indian, who lives in a certain part of India, who eats a certain diet, who has a certain pre-existing condition? That's a very specific subpopulation, and we just don't know until that person gets vaccinated.
Gotcha. I think that's important, just to note again that we're actually watching this happen, in real time. We are experiencing, this new illness and, developing prevention methods and treatment at the same time. And so we're all kind of learning as we go along. So that will be a very important question, not only for the vaccine, but even the long-term effects of COVID-19 itself. The illness, which I think is something else that is being worked on, that I'm assuming you all would say is the same answer, because we haven't had long enough time, to observe individuals with the illness to actually know what these long-term effects would be. We have a question. This is actually a great question that I've heard a lot. It says, it has been stated that children aren't transmitters. Is there any truth to that? And I'm going to add, what is the difference between children getting this disease and adults? I'm going to throw that to Dr. Garrett Cherry.
So yes, children can get COVID. So early in this pandemic, there was some information being reported that children were not affected as severely as, let's say, the older population or adults. We have since learned that children can be affected by COVID-19. Actually, since I think about early December, there has been a number of children who have passed, unfortunately, from COVID-19. And in 2020, it's found that about 2 million people under the age of 18 were diagnosed with COVID-19. And that's the 2 million that were diagnosed. There may be others who were either asymptomatic, meaning that they didn't have any symptoms, but they did have the virus, or they weren't diagnosed. So that lets us know that children and those under the age of 18 can be affected. If they can be affected, they can also transmit it to others. And so the initial information about children not really being as severely affected or not potentially transmitting COVID-19, we have since found is not really accurate, because children have been affected. We've also seen this when in the fall, when schools started to open again, you were seeing several school systems who suddenly decided to open and then close because they found that there were clusters of children in the school system who had contracted and were transmitting COVID-19. And so I think there's still a lot that we need to learn about how COVID-19 affects children, and if there are significant differences between when a child gets it versus when an adult gets it. But one thing that we are pretty certain about at this time is that children can be affected just as adults can.
I think that's a really important point to make. I think in the beginning, like you mentioned, we didn't, have a handle on whether younger people could get it, and we were really focused on the elderly. And so that was a great question. I want to direct this to, all of you actually, if you could break down the timeline. So what is happening is folks are maybe going to a party, or they traveled, they did something weren't really supposed to be doing, and then okay, they test positive. What does the timeline look like? If you do test positive, how many days should you isolate yourself? When are you most contagious to transmit the virus to others? After you've then been quarantined for 14 days, 14 days is the amount of time we keep hearing, can you pass the virus to others after that time? So I'll start with you, Dr. Semenya, and then if you, Dr. Chopra, you have anything to add, then we'll go to you.
So yeah, I'll talk about when you're most contagious to transmit the virus, and that's usually in the first few days of having the infection. That's when you're going to be most contagious. But we do know that it's possible to transmit the virus after the first few days. So that's why people do recommend making sure that you're quarantining for the full 14 days, because it is still possible for you to be able to transmit the virus to others.
Dr. Chopra, could you talk a little bit about what is the magic behind the 14 days? So, after, I'm isolating myself, which what does that even mean? And what is the magic behind the 14 days? What happens in 14 days?
Well, there is no magic. It's a guideline. It's a suggestion. What we found is that based on the evidence, it seems that by that time, you can see some certain markers in your body that suggest you've kind of controlled the virus by then. At least you're not emitting as much virus. Your viral load decreases by that time. So the studies basically, all they do is how much virus, if I were to test positive, how much virus have I had across certain days? So if I test you today, tomorrow, day after, etc., how much virus do you have? And you put that on a graph. And what we noticed, as Amma perfectly pointed out, is that early on in your infection, you're going to have a lot higher virus. And then as the amount of virus reduces, also the amount of virus that you're going to put out into the universe will also reduce. You just have less inside of you, in your mouth, in your nose. But to your point, there's nothing magical happens, and CDC has kind of pulled that guideline back to 10 days, I believe now is what it is. But again, the point is that if you're sick and you're if you're sick enough, you should probably get tested and get a negative test before you decide to believe that you're not going to get anyone else sick. Rather than just believing that you're perfectly recovered, if you're sick, before you decide to go back to life as normal, you should at least get one negative PCR test. Some would say two, because it's the possibility of a false negative result. So there is no magic number. As you pointed out, Bendu, we are figuring this out in real time. Timelines are changing, interpretations are changing, testing is changing. So the best thing you can do is to make sure that you arm yourself with the information, which in this case, all that means is get tested.
Great point. I think that, it's great to acknowledge that because we are learning about this as we're going, guidelines may change. We all remember in the beginning, we didn't know if masks were, if everyone needed to wear them, if just healthcare professionals, and, it just speaks to, how quickly things can change, and that we need to listen to, the experts. We need to, trust the science, and we need to kind of go with the information that we get. So I want to keep looking at questions coming from the chat, and I want to encourage everyone to continue to put the questions in there. So we're going to go to the next one. Have COVID patients in the hospital been given the vaccine? And can you speak a little bit to, what benefit that would serve? to giving patients that are actually in the hospital, like giving them the vaccine? Dr. Semenya?
That's a good question. And to be honest with you, I would not know if COVID patients in the hospital have been given the vaccine. I would assume that because what they're doing is rolling out the vaccine in terms of first responders and healthcare workers first, and then age specific categories as well. I would assume that they may not be giving COVID patients in the hospital the vaccine, but that again would be an assumption. It's something that I don't specifically know. So I don't know if anybody else in the panel knows the answer to that particular question.
Yeah, so this is another one where we're not particularly sure. I think that like Dr. Semenya mentioned, I think we have seen that the priority has been given to first responders and people who are most at risk for getting the disease. And so we don't know if folks that already have tested positive would be in that group. We have another question related to folks getting the vaccine and then still getting sick. So just to clarify again, when you receive the vaccine, what is it actually doing that could possibly be leaving the door open for you to still get sick, even if you've had both doses and you still get sick? Why would it not be working for you?
Okay, so I definitely want to make sure that we hit on a couple of points with that. You said both doses. So again, people have to make sure that they take both doses of the vaccine to ensure that they have optimal immunity. Now, every person is different, and we're still learning a lot about this vaccine. But typically, it can take up to 8 months, if not more, for a person's body, depending on their level of health, to fully develop immunity. So during that time, it is possible that if someone came in contact with an infected person, that they may test positive. The vaccine should prevent that, but there is a possibility because your body is developing those flags, those antibodies, to make sure, as was mentioned earlier, that that person that the body is looking for, that the antibodies are looking for, is there. And it's already been mentioned that there are some caveats to looking for that person. So because every person is different and because it can take several months to develop immunity, there is a possibility that that could happen. Again, having the vaccine should reduce that possibility. It totally depends on the healthiness of the person and their ability to build the optimal level of immunity against the virus.
I think that's
Thank you so
beautiful.
much for
If I can go back to that analogy I used of the picture to maybe elucidate a little bit more. So imagine that the person who is printing out the picture has a dot matrix printer. So instead of you getting a quick picture of the person, it's coming out. So it's taking forever. That's what's happening. We believe that with the Pfizer vaccine, for example, you get the 2 doses, and we believe it'll take up to 2 weeks until you are immune. So there's 2 weeks even after you get your second dose, where you can be confident that you're immune. And then going back to the analogy, sometimes even though it took so long to get that printer of the person out, sometimes when the person comes through your village, he's wearing a mask, or he's wearing a cool little mustache that you may not be able to recognize anymore. So there are things that happen that prevent vaccines from being 100% effective. Some of them have to do with the changing of the bad guy, and some of them have to do with just your own technological problems, essentially.
Gotcha. I think that, if we could speak a little bit to, just that concern about getting the vaccine and still getting sick, do you all have a handle on, how common that's going to be, or how common that is where you get vaccinated and you still get sick? Or could you speak to getting the vaccine and maybe like symptoms being a little bit different from if you hadn't been vaccinated at all? Any thoughts on that? Not all at once.
Yeah, I think some of the information that came out from those clinical trials was that they were looking at the development of symptoms, right? So most of the people were able to mount an immune response that helped to make the symptoms from COVID-19 less severe. So definitely, if you get the vaccine, even if you do get infected with COVID-19, your symptoms should be less severe than if you didn't have the vaccine.
Awesome. And I think that's really good to know. So it's not like all for naught that you get get the vaccine. And, even if you encounter the illness that would have less severe symptoms. We have another question or ask of you all. You talked about, Dr. Garrett Cherry, you talked about clinical trials, and you talked about the process of different groups being included or not included in what we call clinical trials. Can you speak about youth volunteers needed for the Moderna vaccine trial? Because if maybe a concern is that certain groups of people were involved or weren't involved, and how would we know how they will react to the vaccine?
Thank you for asking me that question, because one thing that I feel like we really haven't touched on yet is that there is some age specificity or certain age groups that these vaccines were tested on. So with the Pfizer vaccine, it's really marketed more towards those who are 16 to 17 in the not an adult age range and adults. So if you're 16 and older, that's where the Pfizer vaccine is marketed towards. Whereas with the Moderna vaccine, it's 18 and over. So what that means is for both of those vaccines, if you're in the younger age group, there still is a possibility that this vaccine may not work for you. But those are things that they're trying to figure out now. And so, like you mentioned, there is clinical trials that are being done by both Pfizer and Moderna that are looking at those younger age groups. So Pfizer is doing clinical trials on those who are between 12 and 15 years old. And they're starting to get some data and hoping to have more hopefully in the springtime. And they're interested in bringing in younger children, so even younger than 12, later this year to do the same type of vaccine testing to ensure that in the younger age group, the vaccine is as effective as what they're seeing with adults in the age groups that they've tested thus far. For Moderna, they're looking to do clinical trials for those who are between the ages of 12 and 17. And they actually started some of those clinical trials last month, I believe. They're currently recruiting students. And like you mentioned, I actually did read a report that they're trying to recruit about 3,000 children in that age range. And they're having some difficulty doing that. And that could be for a number of reasons. Number one, these are underage children, so they're going to have to get the consent of their parents in order to be able to participate in these clinical trials. And that could be a limitation in being able to recruit and being able to recruit children in that age range. And so this is something that both of the companies that we currently have vaccines for are working on, making sure that these vaccines are also going to work in those who are in younger age groups. And again, that they're going to be as effective as they are for adults.
Thank you so much. And that is a really important question, because I think as we see these vaccines roll out, it's going to be very important to understand who has been included in these trials, and who has not, and being able to make decisions on which vaccine is potentially right for you. I want to go back to the chat. We have a question about playing outside and playing inside and distance. The question is it safe if I go to a friend's and just play outside? Or if we go inside and stay 6 feet apart and I don't wear a mask? So again, just trying to understand, when is it okay for me to not have my mask on? I think that's the question. Dr. Chopra, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the most safe scenario. So let's start with the most safe scenario. The most safe scenario is you're outdoors and neither of you has COVID, right? That's the most safe scenario. You can feel safe in that situation. The problem is you don't know whether someone has COVID or not unless they're showing symptoms, right? So the risk becomes when you start to go indoors and you're communicating without a mask on. There's so many variables here. How dry is the air? If the air is super dry, the virus can move a little bit more. If it's humid, again, those water droplets come into play and gravity comes into play, right? So that's one concern. Are you talking? Or are you screaming? If you're talking really loudly, your water droplets are gonna travel further. So if you're arguing about politics, for example, you probably don't want to be indoors, right? But the safest scenario is if you're indoors and you're not sure that you both don't have COVID-19. The most safe scenario is stay 6 feet apart, wear a mask. I think I know it is weird, especially when it's someone you've grown up with and it's a family member, but think of the cost benefit here. I can tell you a personal story in my family where someone went from being asymptomatic to dying within 48 hours, actually within 36 hours. I mean, that's how I think Tiana, Amma, both of you point out that this thing is real. Like, we have to work within the constraints of the environment we're in. So yes, it feels impersonal. It feels weird to have a conversation with a family member through a mask, but the cost benefit of an awkward conversation or a weird conversation where you have to repeat yourself a couple of times versus attending a virtual funeral, or that's the worst case scenario, but even someone getting really sick, it doesn't make sense. And it's the best thing to do is to be cautious. If you're indoors, wear a mask, and if at all possible, be outdoors and you can play sports. I play soccer with friends, and all of that is fine, but we just have to be careful. It's the light is at the end of the tunnel. We have the vaccines come in. We have 2 approved. The AstraZeneca one is about to be approved. The Johnson & Johnson one, as Amma pointed out, will likely be approved. So the light is at the end of the tunnel. We just got to hang on for a few more months, and then we can start to pretend life is back to normal.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that if you do have to be indoors as well, definitely wear the mask. But one important thing you can do is to open the windows, because air circulation is key. If you have a lot of air circulation, that helps to ensure that the air droplets aren't staying in the air. So again, if you have to be indoors, try and get as much air circulation indoors as you can.
That's a great tip. I think, just going off of this comment or this question, I think, a lot of our young folks really, want to be around their friends and, want to, interact, in some of the ways they were interacting, before this set in. And so I think those are really great suggestions. Thanks, guys. We're going to roll right into a question that, kind of touches a little bit on some heavier topics. So it says there are discussions around a COVID-19 ID card. What are your thoughts on this, and does it conflict with HIPAA regulations? So I believe this is about being able to identify people who have been vaccinated and people who have not. So here, just your thoughts and opinions on this. That'd be great. I'm going to go with you, Dr. Garrett Cherry.
It's complicated, right? If we can be honest about that. I do know that there has been other countries who have implemented something similar to that. And as people continue to get vaccinated, they're actually getting a card. They're getting a COVID vaccination card. And so we can't imagine a future in which having to show that card the way you would have to show a driver's license or the way you would have to show some type of identification may be mandated, may be something that is required. For the general safety of society, I think it's important that we do have some understanding of who has been vaccinated and who hasn't. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to a level of ubiquitous or overall vaccination within the population where we have enough people where the actual transmission of the virus is significantly reduced. And having that type of specific identification will not be important. But it's difficult. It would be difficult to implement. It would be difficult for some people to adhere to. So I think there's going to be potentially some controversy around that. And so it would just be interesting to see how within the United States we handle something to that degree.
I would say internationally, it's not unprecedented. For instance, with the yellow fever vaccine, they do give you an actual card that's yellow that proves that you have had the yellow fever vaccine. And so for certain countries, in order to be able to get into those countries, you actually do have to show that vaccination card that will allow you to be admitted into the country. So it is something that has happened before.
That's a great point. And I think, related to that question, I was going to ask, about schools reopening and, just what you guys think of when we would be able to see students, especially younger students, actually re-enter schools. We talked a little bit about schools that tried reopening and then ended up having to close again. So when do you think that it would be safe for our young folks to go back to school? I'm going to go with Dr. Chopra on this one.
I don't know. I think the timeline right now for vaccinations, and this is a mixture of what I've read and what my own opinion is. So please don't take this to be like a real timeline. But I think what's going to happen is within the next 3 or 4 months, we're going to start to robustly vaccinate elderly folks. We're already doing that a little bit. We're starting to do that. We did healthcare personnel first and people in long-term living situations, facilities, sorry. By the summer, we will have a significant portion, I hope, of the elderly population older than 65 vaccinated. And then through the fall, folks like us will start to get vaccinated. And I think maybe by the end of this year is a time where it's safe enough to open up schools and, sorry, I should say that differently, safe enough to open up schools in a way that was similar to pre-pandemic. This virus is going to stay with us for the rest of humankind. It's basically a part of our lives now. We're going to have to vaccinate. We're going to have to update vaccines. So things are never going to go back to normal, aka pre-pandemic, but things will start to appear to have a semblance of normality because we'll know that the folks that are at the highest risk, aka my parents' generation and many of those watching, your grandparents' generation, they are protected from the worst outcomes of this pandemic. So the honest answer is we don't know, but hopefully by the end of the year, the fall, we'll start to see things go back to normal. I'm curious what the other panelists think.
Yeah, any thoughts on, what you see as, us being able to have our young folks, go back to some of their, regular activities and being able to go back to school, go back to concerts and some of the things that they're really missing out on. Any thoughts, Dr. Garrett Cherry or Dr. Semenya?
Okay, I'll chime in here. It's going to take some time. for things to get back to pre-pandemic levels. I think that right now we are still trying to see how we can navigate society while doing social distancing and wearing a mask and washing our hands. And there are some restaurants that are still open. There are some facilities that are still open, but opening at a limited capacity. To be able to get back to what we experienced before the pandemic, I just think it's going to take some time. Having a high level of people globally who are vaccinated is going to help that. Making sure that even through this high vaccination period that we're going to have over the next year and a half, maybe even 2 years, that we continue our best practices will definitely help with that. And then we may just see the way we saw a tiered decrease in travel and a tiered decrease in people being able to go out to restaurants and to other types of venues. We may see a tiered increase over time based off of the number of COVID cases that we see, the number of COVID deaths that we see, and also what is going to happen with the vaccine long term. So the longer we have to determine how the vaccine is going to affect people and their immunity. So it's just going to take some time. It's likely going to be a tiered increase in the freedoms that we experienced prior to the pandemic. But it's just something that we're going to have to kind of just sit and wait for. But as long as we are stringent in vaccination and best practices around preventing COVID, I think we're moving in the best direction.
Thank you so much. I think that's great to, just emphasize again the preventative measures, and that being kind of our route to be able to, kind of go back to, normal. I want to ask, because I think it's important for our young audience, you guys are obviously experts in your fields, and you're highly educated, and you're able to kind of discern, information that you get from TV and from the internet. But, we other folks may be watching the news and they see things online and TV every day about the virus and about the vaccine, but it is not always clear like what you're supposed to believe. So I want to touch on this a little bit. How should we search for truthful information? And how should we be able to tell truthful information from information that's potentially misleading? I'm going to go to Dr. Chopra first for this one.
So I'm so glad you asked this question. This is something that's really close to my heart. We talked about the word tiers. I think that's a great word here. There are tiers of reliable information. There's the highest level of reliability where you go to the original manuscript, the scientific manuscript. That's the ultimate highest level of reliability. Again, not 100% reliable, because as all four of us know, there are some questionable manuscripts out there, but in general, that's the highest level. The next, but that's not, to be fair, that's not accessible to 90% of the population, either because of monetary reasons or because they haven't been trained in the jargon that those papers include. So the next level down from that are good scientific writers, and that's the level I'd like to highlight. So the best scientific writers, in my opinion, are some of the journalistic outlets that I'm going to list. The Atlantic. I think the best writing for COVID-19 has been by Ed Yong, who works for The Atlantic. Guardian Science has been really great. I think, in fact, in preparing for this question, I looked at some of the folks on Twitter, because again, a lot of us will get information from Twitter, myself included. So there's actually a search. If you go to Twitter and search for, in quotes, COVID-19 health experts, you'll get a bunch of the folks I'm talking about. They are epidemiologists, they are scientists, They're physicians who are in the fight for COVID-19, and they're all brilliant science communicators. So what they're doing is they're reading the highest tier, those PubMed articles, and they're distilling them in a way that everyone can understand them, that information. So that's another resource that I would highlight. But if you're someone who likes to get their news from news outlets, then Atlantic, New York Times, The Guardian, Science are my three favorites.
Awesome. Dr. Garrett-Cherry, Dr. Semenya, would you like to add any resources that you think would be great for folks that are really trying to get reliable, trustworthy information?
So I'm a little biased because I spent the majority of my career working within state and local health departments. And I tend to find that people don't realize that these agencies have websites that give them great information. A lot of this information is actually taken directly from the CDC website. It may be modified just a little bit to fit the population that they're talking about in their location, but they provide really great information. So I always suggest that a person goes to the website for their state and local health department to find information about COVID-19 and a lot of other different illnesses. In addition to that, the CDC, I might be a little biased, but I always find that they have great information, firsthand information that is easy to read. I know that they work really hard to make sure that it's at a level that, you know, the general population can read it and gain a lot of knowledge from it. So I would suggest the local or state health department and the CDC websites.
Yeah, I think those are all really great resources that you guys brought up. I would say also, if you want to actually talk to somebody in person, I think great resources can be like your community health centers, or you can talk to your pediatrician or your primary care physician. They would also be really great resources as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for outlining those. I think it's a really good start, you know, that we were able to have this discussion today and, you know, speak to folks directly by answering their questions that they've posed. But again, you know, we don't want folks to just stop, you know, here. If you have more questions, those resources are there. And I think those will be, you know, outlined in the chat. And we're going to do one last question before we wrap up. How can the youth educate and raise awareness of the virus with their peers? Deanna's mentioning, I'm finding that in the schools, they are not talking about COVID. And we know a lot of our students are virtually learning right now. And she mentions education and accountability is key. So if it's not necessarily being taught in schools, how would young people who have watched this webinar and want to talk about and raise awareness of the virus with their peers, besides just sharing this video with them? What would your suggestions be?
So, I mean, I was a kid once, right? And what I found was I always learned best through people's experiences. So I say, you know, just spark a conversation. I'm sure that there may be a young person who knows someone who had COVID, may have experienced it themselves, you know, maybe have a story to tell about a parent, a grandparent, an aunt and uncle or cousin, and, you know, wants to share it. And so I think really making sure that younger people can have relatable stories is the most important thing. Sometimes I know it can feel a little distant, you know, talking about diseases and talking about vaccines and talking about treatments. And you sometimes need to put a face on something for it to become relatable and believable. I think this may be the best approach to use with youth. And you know, honestly driving home to them that, again, this is a real disease, but there are people working very hard to make sure that, you know, we're trying to get society back to pre-pandemic levels, try to get things back to normal. And, there are actual things that a person can do to make sure that the illness does not spread. And so I think just by making things relatable and making it a safe space to share information, it would work among youth.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Garrett Cherry. I think that's, one of the goals of today's webinar is to just get folks talking. And, as I mentioned, being able to potentially share this video with your friends or talking about it. And like she mentioned, having a face to go along with it. And so I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Chopra, Dr. Semenya, and Dr. Garrett Cherry, for sharing your expertise with us for this interactive panel. We are all giving you a virtual round of applause. I want to thank all of you who have participated by submitting your questions and comments in the chat. Feel free to keep posting your questions and comments after the live broadcast ends, as we hope to address them in future webinars. So I want to thank my fellow Youth Speak Up founders, Tiana Adams, Dion Johnson Calhoun, for another successful event. I invite all of you to keep up with us on Instagram at Youth Speak Up 1, that is the number 1, on Facebook and on YouTube. Don't forget to hit the like button, especially if you watched all the way to the end. Go ahead and hit like and hit subscribe so that you don't miss the next broadcast. We are looking for youth panelists from the collegiate, high school, and middle school levels to participate in our next few events. So if you have young folks to recommend, send them our way. And if you have enjoyed the video, go ahead and share it. On behalf of Youth Speak Up, I want to say thank you so much for being with us in this live webinar, and stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.